American voters, unfortunately, seem to be cursed with an almost limitless supply of masochism or self loathing or maybe unwarranted optimism, if you want to call it that. There's this perennial hope or wishful thought that we can actually implement change by voting. Seriously, it calls to mind the historic long suffering of Chicago Cubs fans, or that iconic image of Lucy and Charlie Brown with the football, where she promises she's not going to yank it away this time, and he believes her every time, and of course she does, and he winds up flat on his back. These are metaphors for me that best capture politics in the U.S. Every once in a while, an actual challenge emerges that might shake up the ruling order, or at least bring about change in some real way. Then the ruling class closes ranks, shuts it down without mercy. This has been true with the Democrats going way back from Henry Wallace up to and including Jesse Jackson. When Wallace was VP in 1944, the spot was snatched away from him with literally minutes to go at the convention in favor of Harry Truman, the guy who swore that he never lost a night's sleep over dropping the atom bomb. Now, no one can predict or rewrite history, but in cases where the outcome certainly would have been very different, it turns out to be a self-correcting closed loop system. No change is allowed or even possible. So this is the case with the so-called the Biden miracle. What we're supposed to believe is that despite Sanders' huge momentum with enormous enthusiasm, spectacular public rallies, even in Boston and in Springfield, he underperformed. And to such an extent that changed the character of the race in one fell swoop. Other moderates who had been preparing for this huge day, Super Tuesday, on which they had already spent tens of millions of dollars, simply gave up and united behind Biden. And in turn, all of their supporters, and then some, flocked to Biden en masse, literally overnight. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't pass the smell test, as they say. Now, part of the glibness with which they expect us to buy this narrative is that they don't even admit what happened last time. It just doesn't work that way, ever. Didn't work in 2016. Sanders tried, much to the dismay of many, to convince his supporters to vote for Clinton. And to a devastating extent, they wouldn't. And black folks didn't bother to show up in the enormous numbers the party relies on for every Democrat victory since Johnson. They'd rather blame it on Russia. Maybe because they ignored the main lesson of 2016. They genuinely think people are stupid enough to believe this comeback kid fairy tale. Of course, there are levels of belief, but it's instructive to talk to working people, to poor people, and to listen to their conversations. You hear things like, oh, see, the whole thing is rigged. You can tell. It's totally fixed. Someone got to Klobuchar and Buttigieg. Oh, well, now you see why I don't vote. They're much less likely to trust the system than the professional class, who talk to others in their class at the yacht club, in their own social circles, and so on. They have more to protect, and they treat the institutions and process as sacrosanct. But then it's that stratum of the population, the upper quintile or the upper 20%, that the system is designed to keep loyal. I mean, in addition to just being a conduit to keep money moving up to the 1%. And keep in mind, it's not a court of law. No one needs to prove it. You can't. And it's incredibly sophisticated, but it's a gut thing. As Marx said, knowledge goes through the gut. And so people just don't vote, especially if there is no candidate that represents them, or they just feel they've gotten screwed. So why do they feel so alienated? And how does the mechanism work to prevent change? It's complicated. For the promoters of change in U.S. politics, there's always been this a two-step strategy, inside the Democratic Party or outside. And both have their own traps and are designed that way. Critics of the Sanders approach point out not only the weaknesses in his failure to take on imperialism head on, but for the venal sin of believing that you can trust a party that argues in court that it's not bound by law to even follow its own rules. This is a party that has been derided as the graveyard of social movements by many on the left, whose main purpose is to corral dissent into its old fold and then quietly put it back to sleep. But the outside strategy, at least in the electoral arena, is just as hopeless. They work very hard to make it that way. It's almost impossible to get on ballots as a third party, and the entire apparatus is designed as a smooth machine to manipulate, trivialize, exclude any move outside the two-party box. So this prompts populists like Sanders and Jackson before him to think that maybe, just maybe, if we run within the party and overwhelm it with new energy, we might deliver a knockout blow and somehow grab a hold of the levers of control. Again, think Charlie Brown and Lucy and the football. This time it'll work. So I don't really blame either tendency for trying. And this, I believe, is what happened in Nevada and California. And it scares the living crap out of the powers that be, hence the closing of ranks. It's a many tentacled beast, and it's remarkably sophisticated. In the first place, what we call elections are rigged in a well insulated systemic way that no one even bothers to deny. Change is a threat, and you take care of threats. How? By neutralizing them. So, okay, what happens before we even get to the polls at all? An incredible array of weapons is put into play. Take Bloomberg, this racist billionaire who was a Republican until like yesterday, is allowed to spend $500 million of his fortune, billion, 500 million, $500 million to force his perspective into every TV, social media platform, device, video game in the country, 24/7, nonstop. And what is the message? Well, billionaires aren't the enemy. Change should be gradual. Sanders is dangerous. Black voters should trust centrists. In fact, black people should trust the very forces and the very people like Bloomberg or Biden who are responsible for their mass incarceration, the stop and frisk, and policies that directly harm their communities. It's not an outright endorsement of Biden, but it might as well be. And of course, what we saw the other day in the aftermath of his dropping out in endorsing Biden, that's exactly what it amounts to. Self-correcting system. Add this to the general, the nonstop media attacks on Sanders. He's a communist, he's an anti-Semite, sexist, an outsider, on and on and on, culminating in the pundit class losing their goddamn minds in the wake of Nevada, not to mention generations of gaslighting African Americans into believing that the party of the Klan and the party of the atom bomb is really the party of the New Deal and the party of civil rights. And so staying on the safe Democrat plantation is their only choice. And don't forget the exclusion of Tulsi Gabbard, now the only woman and the only person of color still running, as well as the only true anti-war voice. She met their threshold for inclusion in the debates, got a delegate in American Samoa, came in second. So they moved the goalpost and denied her anyway. Closed loop system. So it really is an incredibly powerful cocktail to suppress dissent while leaving a footprint that is not so heavy-handed as sending in the tanks. Though increasingly the tanks are there in these military arsenals that local PDs are forming. And of course, the already genocidal police targeting of black youth. But even all these layers of power are not always enough. And yet there are no tanks that we can see. So what do? You cheat. Easy. For those of us who live in Massachusetts, we're particularly left scratching our heads on Tuesday, huh? Like, we expected to wake up to the news of a toss-up between Sanders and Warren, and maybe Biden dropping out of the race because he was a walking corpse. Sure, there's the old head theory that older black voters saw Biden as a safe bet, They're skeptical of radical white dudes promising change, and the Obama coattail effect. Although those have been mysteriously slow to attach, right? Only in South Carolina. And it didn't happen until now, and it didn't happen with any of the earlier black candidates. So something seems wrong there. So that might make sense in South Carolina, actually, with where they account for a large percentage of Democrat primary voters, or Alabama, maybe Texas, but Massachusetts, Minnesota, where there are hardly any black people, it doesn't make sense. Things that make you go, Lo and behold, some people really do still pay attention to the nitty gritty of this hopeless, crappy election system. TDMS Research put out an analysis of the Massachusetts vote, which showed an 8.5% tilt toward Biden over Sanders between the exit poll data and the reported precinct vote count. So, by contrast, on the Republican side, the same analysis shows a virtually identical result. Vote count matched the exit polling computer model dead on, less than 1% discrepancy. So exit polls have always been considered the gold standard by international organizations to detect instances of election fraud, and they're considered more reliable than actual vote counts. I mean, think about it. You're telling a pollster what you just did, not what you might do at a future date or what you believe about some vague principle. So it's very considered very reliable. It's not believable that people would just lie as a monolith. In fact, it has been used to discredit foreign elections, even by U.S. agencies. And of course, the U.S. is this patchwork of systems with no coordination, a heavy reliance on technology, these voting machines that the French government is trying to ban, for example, no paper ballots that every country, virtually every country in the whole world uses, right? I mean, how exceptional is the US? Well, that's one way. So, good luck trying to prove it, any of it. I mean, outside of that smoking gun of this discrepancy. But like I said, that's not a strong enough argument to force people into voting when they feel robbed. You can't just say, you can't prove it. So I'm fully convinced that Massachusetts was stolen for Biden. And I suspect that similar shenanigans may have happened in Minnesota, maybe Texas or other places. But this, again, goes back to the larger systemic picture that lays the groundwork. The real takeaway from election 2000, that debacle, the one that really counts, is the discrediting of exit polls as unreliable. That is, despite the fact that they're not only used as the gold standard, as like I just said, but the same news organizations have for years relied on them chiefly to predict correctly outcomes in races before the votes were even counted, and before they closed, which they changed in the aftermath. But also in the aftermath of Florida 2000s, Americans are trained to believe the opposite of the truth. So in this sort of bizarro world where exit polls are unreliable and voting machines are, I mean, and such polls are only used for demographic data and opinion splitting by different subtypes and categories. Most Americans now think that is the main purpose of them. In fact, in a lot of cases, it's hard to get the raw data because it's proprietary by the news organizations. But so that's just one more example of how powerful the "we are free" mythology is to screw American voters. We're conditioned, gaslit, brainwashed to believe that somehow the worst voting system on the planet is instead the crown jewel of the world's greatest democracy, the envy of the world. And in the end, all it takes, aside from that massive systemic rigging, is an occasional light thumb on the scale, only when all else fails, and only as heavy as needed to get the job done without being caught. God bless America, right? So what now? Who knows? The trouble is, Sanders is prone to doing exactly the wrong thing. He certainly did it in 2016. What happens with all these kids, this incredible new enthusiasm for change, the belief that the power of the people can somehow give us hope and make our lives better? In 2016, it was left to dissipate while Sanders endorsed his own tormentors, kind of like George Bush and Gore shaking hands at the inauguration in 2000. Bone chilling. Chilling is the right word. What a lot of us have been saying for a long time is that there has to be another plan, some attempt to build off this energy and not let it get sucked back into the great graveyard of social movements that is the Democratic Party. They claim to want new voters, but then they do everything possible to alienate and abuse them. Biden even telegraphs he's considering choosing a Republican for VP. I mean, for Christ's sakes, Biden, the force behind the crime bill, Biden, who didn't want his kids growing up in some sort of racial jungle, or Biden, the guy who praised Bush for invading Iraq. They think this guy can win by stealing white votes from the Republicans. Wake up, you jackass. You can't win without the emerging black and brown vote coalition that you dismiss and deride. And these new kids are not going to make the same mistake twice. Fool me once. That's all you get. Why should they? And it's not our fault on the left. You know, we don't own their votes and their minds. You just can't browbeat people into voting when they feel there's nothing to hope for. And Biden is perhaps, he's terrible. The least inspiring candidate since at least Mondale, you know. And so it won't matter what Sanders says or does. It won't matter what the black churches say on Sundays. It won't matter what the party elders say. That's just not how it works. You don't force people. People don't respond if you treat them as if they don't have any agency. Oh, the chill thing, the whole process of chilling out the heat of the moment, or dousing the hope with cynicism and this boogeyman fear of Trump, orange man bad. It's completely deliberate. Like some billionaire Gulliver pissing out the fires of populism. People are meant to learn that important lesson. And the younger, the better. No, you can't have nice things. No, you can't hope for any real change. No, you can't take control of your life and make it just even a little bit better. Shut up and line up behind the walking corpse that is Joe Biden. He may be demented and reactionary and have no ideas, you know, but he's better than the other guy. Now go vote. They won't. They'll say, fuck him. And who will be surprised? You know, I mean, it's very depressing. It's an important moment, and it's been worth following. But maybe we've just wasted enough time on this shit show. Like, look around. Julian Assange is still languishing in jail for revealing U.S. war crimes. The bombing in Afghanistan goes on unabated, even before the ink is dry on this so-called peace plan. And the CIA and the creepy special forces and all the other little alphabet agencies are still slithering around the world doing the dirty work of empire. And workers and poor people are struggling and dying with no end in sight. That has to be our focus. And it has to be our crisis and our emergency. Billions of lives are at stake.